Snuggle up, get comfortable, dim the lights, and let the city outside slowly grow quiet. Take a deep breath and feel the weight of your day settle into the pillow beneath you. This is a story based on a true case, told and gently fictionalized through my eyes. If you like the way I tell it, please subscribe and like the podcast. It helps me keep a steady lamp on the desk. And if you feel like it, leave a comment to say where you're listening from, what time it is where you are, or which case you'd like me to tell next. Before I begin to speak of nights that felt both ordinary and crooked, let me tell you who I am and who I knew then. It keeps me honest and keeps the map of memory tidy. I was Evelyn Margaret Marlowe, a reporter for a small city paper called the Daily Ledger in New York City. I was 28 in the summer of 1906, living in a narrow apartment on the Upper West Side, 2 flights up, windows that looked out over a stoop, and a street lamp that hummed like a distant moth. That summer, the city had a particular weight. New York in the mid-1970s was breathing hard. Budgets cut, storefronts shuttered, banks nervous, and a tired hum of worry in the air. People knew it in their hands, in the way my neighbors spoke quietly of layoffs, in the way subway riders guarded wallets and words. Crime had been rising. You could see it in rusted fire escapes and the flashing advertisements for bail bonds above neighborhood diners. The skyline still held its familiar piles of brick and water towers, but there was an undercurrent of frayed patience on corners and in the late-night buses that carried me home from the newsroom. If you want a small picture of my life before these nights became different, I wrote obituaries on Tuesdays, court notes on Thursdays, and most nights I walked home with my notebook in the pocket of my coat. I drank coffee that burned my tongue, and if I lingered near a late-night diner, it was to watch waitresses name the regulars and to listen to radio DJs spin records between snatches of city news. I took the 1 train and sometimes the 2 when the 1 was running late. My routine was modest, reporting, filing copy, folding myself into quiet rooms to write, and it gave me a kind of ordinary steadiness. I should tell you too that the cast of people in my head, the names I will keep returning to, were constant. They are the people who color the memory for me. Donna Loria, who was 19. Jody Valenti, who was 18, and with Donna, the night things began. Carl Denaro, Virginia Voskerichian, Christine Freund, Stacy Moskowitz. These are not characters I invented. They were real lives, brief and bright in the memory of a city that likes to move forward. I will use their full names when I can, because they deserve to be known and not reduced to headlines. And then there is the man who called himself the Son of Sam, David Richard Berkowitz, young, adopted, complicated, and later known to all of us who followed the case. There are a few other names that live at the edges of my notebook. The editors who fed me assignments, the detectives who called in the small hours, the clerks who kept the files, and the neighbors who spoke in whispers over their kitchen sinks. But let's keep the list simple for a slow night like this. I will return to these full names as we go, and I will keep them the same. Consistency is a kind way to remember. Take another breath. Let your mind wander to the humming street lamp outside my window. Hear the distant siren, an ordinary sound in New York, and the soft rattle of a passing bus. At this point in the summer of 1976, those sounds were comfortable. They were the soundtrack to late-copy deadlines and paint-peeling stoops. They were not yet shouted in alarm. You may wonder when the city shifted for me from being merely tired to being cautious. That change began the night I first heard a police scanner in the newsroom chatter about a shooting, For weeks before, there had been reports of purse snatchings and muggings, of men taken abruptly, and of storefronts boarded up against a winter we could not yet name. But those were, in a way, public problems. You read them in print, you nodded, and you kept walking. What I could not have known, what none of us could have known then, was how a small pattern could tighten and stretch across boroughs until it felt like a net. How parked cars at midnight, couples in the hush of a summer street, and a certain kind of quiet were suddenly, quietly dangerous. I will tell you those nights as I remember them. In the way the light from sodium lamps pooled on the hood of a parked car, in the smell of humid air at 2 a.m, and in the way the newsroom felt heavier with every call. Before we step out onto those streets, I want to remind you softly that this is my telling of true events. I was there, I listened, I recorded, and I am remembering. Yet between memory and fact, there is always a little shadow where feeling sits. I will be candid about feelings, about fear, about exhaustion, about how routine was disrupted, because that is my voice here. I will not sensationalize the terrible. Please rest assured, my tone tonight is quiet and gentle. We will move slowly together. Do you hear that? A car passing, tires whispering over asphalt. Let it pass. Let your shoulders drop a little more. Ask yourself, what does a city sound like when it is trying to sleep? For me, in 1906, it sounded like streetlights, half-muted radios, coffee machines, and the faint turning of pages in a newsroom when a reporter stayed late. There are a few moments I keep circling in my mind before the first shooting. The clink of a coin on the diner counter, the smell of grease and coffee, a late subway car arriving empty except for one tired woman reading a paperback. Those simple, ordinary things will stand in contrast with the coming nights. But we are not there yet. We will go step by step, night by night. For now, let the hum of the city settle you. Keep your breath even. We will begin softly with a night in late July. There is a first knock in this story's sequence, and I remember hearing it. But that is a story for the next chapter. Take a deep breath. Let your shoulders uncoil. In the hush between one neighborhood and the next, I will describe the people and the neighborhoods that threaded through those summers. I will move slowly, the way I did when I took notes in my thin reporter's notebook. One name, one street, one small observation at a time. New York in the mid-1970s was a city of boroughs that still had edges. The Bronx had broad avenues and smaller side streets where under streetlights you could feel the warmth of people still awake. Queens was, to me, a map of families and enclave neighborhoods. Forest Hills, with its quieter blocks and pockets of green. Brooklyn's stoops and tenements held their own rhythms, and the Upper West Side where I lived had late-night diners and a ribbon of quieter streets where couples would walk after the theater or a movie. I remember the smell of the city in summer, hot tar and humid air, coffee and frying oil at the diner, the green tang of parked trees after rain. Streetlights pooled yellow on parked cars and created small islands where shadow and light met. Radios in cars hummed AM stations, soft music, weather updates, the occasional commercial. There were police sirens, yes, but there were also the small human sounds of a neighborhood, the clack of heels on wet pavement, the murmur of two friends talking on a stoop, the late-night laugh from a diner booth. My job as a reporter had me moving through these places at odd hours. I would meet a source at a 24-hour coffee shop in Queens, wait outside a courthouse in the late afternoon, or take the train into the Bronx for a community board meeting. The boroughs were both different and familiar to me, and I loved the small ways they taught me about people. How Forest Hills residents kept their windows shut in sweltering nights to muffle the heat. How the Bronx stoops often had small clusters of neighbors who watched the world quietly, and how Brooklyn's diners had staff who knew everyone's coffee order. And so, when night started to change, when the pattern of shots at parked cars began to carve a new, nervous energy into the city, I noticed it in neighborhood details. I noticed the way couples stopped lingering in cars. I noticed women with short hair cut in the daylight, lamenting to friends that long hair made them feel exposed in a quiet street. I noticed people hesitating before stepping into the shadows between a car and a stoop. The city's ordinary choreography adjusted. People rewrote small routines to accommodate fear. Let me tell you about a few of the people whose names I promised I would keep intact. I will speak gently of them, because memory is a room you enter quietly. Donna Laria, 19, was in the Bronx on the night of July 29th, 1906. She and her friend Jody Valenti were in a parked car when the shots came. Jody, 18, survived with wounds. Donna did not. The name Donna still sits heavy in my notebook and my memory, because hers was the first fall that made the city take notice in a new way. She was young, and the detail of youth, which had once felt like small invulnerability, suddenly felt brittle. Virginia Voskerikian, Christine Freund, Stacy Moskowitz, and Carl Denaro are names that collected around the same pattern: nights under sodium lamps and the hush of cars. Each of them, each household, and each family lived as if a soft net had been thrown over the city's ordinary life. People began to worry in the ways that people in the city always do, quietly, by changing the walk home, by parking under brighter lights, by altering dates and plans. The people closest to me then were a mix of editors, cops, clerks, and neighbors. Martin O'Connor, my editor at the Ledger, had a gravelly voice and a steady hand when he returned my copy. He trusted me to go out and return with facts. There was a desk sergeant at the local precinct who began to call me with updates on unusual tips. I did not know his full name, and in my notebook he often appears as just the voice on the phone. There was also a clerk, Ruth DeLuca, who organized evidence and paperwork at the courthouse. She had a habit of folding her handkerchief into a tiny square and putting it into her pocket. These people were my anchors, human, careful, tired, and they kept me connected to the city in ways that were ordinary and reliable. In the neighborhoods, Forest Hills, the Bronx, Brooklyn brownstones, people's routines were plain. Couples occasionally parked at the edge of a park to talk after a movie. Teenagers lingered outside record shops. A man named Sam on my block always walked his dog at midnight and tipped his hat to me if we passed. Those small rituals were the scaffolding of nights. And as the shootings continued, those rituals changed. Men who once waited for late trains sat with a friend until daylight. People avoided dim parking lots and occasionally took taxis for short distances they once would have walked. How did the city look to the person walking it at night? Streetlights gleamed against wet pavements after rain. Tires whispered across bridges. Storefronts shuttered early. Neon signs hummed above bars. You could feel the city breathing through its metal bones. Elevated tracks, subway grates, the slow, reliable groan of the Roosevelt Avenue buses. And when the fear took hold, it was visible in the way lights stayed on in kitchen windows later into the night, in the way neighbors began to check on one another more often, and in the way the police presence pulsed in certain neighborhoods. Sometimes I would stop and sit at a diner's counter simply to watch how a city remade itself at night. People changed their hairstyles, as I mentioned. Shorter cuts, practical cuts, because hair felt like an unnecessary risk on a summer night. Lovers tried to avoid parked cars. Parents discouraged late-night outings. It was not a dramatic change. It was a gradual, practical one. The city did not stop living. It adapted. Do you feel sleepy yet? Let your breathing find that steady in and out rhythm. Ask yourself, what small change would you make tonight to feel safer? For many New Yorkers then, the change was as small as selecting a brighter route home. We have the map of people and places now. We know where I lived and how I moved, who tended the newsroom, and some of the names I will return to. We know that the city itself, the Bronx, Queens, Brooklyn, the Upper West Side, Forest Hills, was where this pattern took shape. In the next chapter, I will tell you about the first night that shifted everything, the night of July 29th, 1906. But that is a story for the next chapter. Take a deep breath. Let the air settle in your chest like a soft weight. I remember that summer night as a slow, ordinary evening in the newsroom until the scanner grid turned to a voice with an address. I will tell you what I remember about the first night that made the city hold its breath, and I will try to speak quietly so that the memory does not startle you awake. It was July 29th, 1906. I had been at the Ledger later than usual, working on a small feature about local community gardens. The city heat had made the night sticky. There was that particular slow humidity that makes voices seem wrapped in wool. I left the office at close to midnight, folded my notebook into my coat, and took the walk home that I had taken for years. The streetlight on my block hummed a little louder than usual. A man 2 stoops down walked his dog, and a milk truck idled at the end of the block. Everything looked like a late summer postcard. I did not know, the moment I crossed Broadway, that a young woman named Donna Laurier and her friend Jody Valenti were sitting in a car in the Bronx, somewhere under a soft halo of a sodium lamp, thinking maybe of a movie or about music, or about the next ordinary hour. They had stopped, as people do, in a moment of shared quiet. Parked cars at the edge of parks or along side streets are ordinary places to talk. In New York, they have long been a small kind of privacy. The call came through the newsroom about an hour later. A voice on the police scanner, a neighbor in the precinct, calling the Ledger with the precinct's limited details because we were the paper that covered that neighborhood most closely. I can still picture the sergeant's voice, low, careful, saying that there'd been a shooting in the Bronx and that a young woman had died. I remember the surreal quality of listening, a death announced almost like a schedule item, but with a weight that made it impossible to keep typing with the same casual air. When I arrived at the precinct, the air felt condensed, hot and quiet, the way a room feels when people are trying to think. I watched officers talk in groups that broke off into smaller groups. Someone passed me a short, typed statement with names. Donna Laurier, 19, killed. Jody Valenti, 18, wounded. The words on the paper were flat and ordinary, and yet, when I read them, the room tilted slightly. I called the family numbers with my notebook in my hand and left messages. The way we did things then was slower and more intimate than it is now. It felt wrong to page through the names like a list, but part of my job was to record, carefully and plainly, who was gone. I remember the smell of the precinct that night, coffee gone cold at the desk, the faint smell of tobacco that clung even on no-smoking nights, the metallic note of rotating file drawers. An officer handed me a small folded photograph of Donna. She was young in the picture, the kind of candid shot families keep in wallets, and I felt, for a moment, that I knew her as I would know anyone in the neighborhood I love. There was a tenderness in seeing a face suddenly attached to the words. We were starting to draw a pattern without knowing it. That pattern, men or a man, late at night, couples in parked cars, would be repeated in ways that made the city notice. But that first night, the city still hoped that it was an isolated, terrible thing. How can I say it quietly? Hope was a thing we could still carry. I filed a short piece for the Ledger that night. The copy was sparse. Who, what, where, when. The editor asked me what people were saying in the neighborhood. I wrote about small groups talking on stoops and about how people checked on one another. On the ride home, I found myself looking at every parked car as if it held a small mystery. I thought of Donna and Jody and of other young people who might be parked in quiet streets. A steady, private worry began to nestle into me. Over the following nights, more calls came into the newsroom. At first, the police said they had few details to share. We learned slowly of another shooting in Queens, of a woman in a Brooklyn car who had been wounded, and of reports that suggested the same kind of gun, .44 caliber rounds, had been used. The term spree had not yet been applied. It was only in our private conversations, in the way my editor Marty would lean back and count on his fingers, that we began to sense a pattern. In those early days, disbelief and confusion walked through the city like two companions. How could it be that someone was choosing parked cars? It seemed, at first, to be blind cruelty rather than a pattern with intent. Yet as more incidents were reported, the idea that something bigger was happening started to press on the edges of what we wrote. As a reporter, part of me did what reporters do. I collected details methodically. I watched what people did to keep themselves safe. I noted where they parked, which streetlights were left on, which diners still had late-night regulars. The work felt strangely domestic, note-taking and listening and returning to type. And yet, underneath it, there was a steady, low hum of tension. On the third night after Donna's death, a woman in Forest Hills told me she had cut her hair short because you can't be careful with long hair. A man in Brooklyn said he would walk his daughter to the bus stop and not let her wait alone. Those small life edit changes are the kind of quiet we see when fear arrives. They are not heroic or dramatic. They are loving and practical. When we filed the Ledger's coverage that week, the paper's copy room smelled of fresh ink. We had placed a small box on the front page. An image, a quiet line, a neighborhood notice. People called the paper that night. So many tips came in. People who had seen something, people who had driven by a street and noticed a car at midnight. The police scanner at the station was busy, and we at the Ledger tried to keep pace. Do you feel your breath moving? Let it slow. In the next chapter, I will tell you about how the city's fear lengthened its shadow and how the police and the public began to respond in earnest. We will trace the pattern into other boroughs and begin to speak of names that will appear often in official files. But that is a story for the next chapter. Take a gentle breath. Let the world soften at the edges. In this chapter, I will describe how the investigation unfolded, the way the police reacted, and how the city's attention shifted toward one possibility, that a single person might be responsible for a string of late-night attacks. After the first few shootings, The NYPD moved from curiosity to concentration. The department formed a task force, an assembly room of detectives who pooled notes, photographs, and witness statements in a manner that felt both methodical and urgent. I remember walking into the precinct one grey morning and seeing a wall covered in maps, strings, and yellowing photographs pinned with small green tabs. The room smelled faintly of coffee and ozone from an old electric fan. Men and women in plain clothes moved through the room like slow currents. Cases and tips were filed and refiled. The desks were piled with hundreds of notes from callers and paper packets, with witness sketches. The task force was, in those months, a living object of pressure. City officials leaned on detectives to produce answers quickly. There were nightly conversations between precinct commanders and the mayor's office. The papers, my paper included, published detailed accounts and callers poured in with leads, some serious, many not. We received thousands of tips. Some were helpful and detailed, others were small, misunderstood observations, born of fear and rumination. Surveillance operations began to appear in neighborhoods that had once been quiet. Plainclothes officers sat in unmarked cars under streetlights, their radios low and steady. The police presence, once more diffuse, narrowed into focus. 2 officers might sit for hours under a tree, watching parked cars and couples who dared to stop. At night, the city had the look of a theatre set. Lights in certain places, dark pockets in others, and the constant motion of people whose routines had been quietly interrupted. I will not dramatize the work of the detectives. They were professionals doing a long, patient job. They took thousands of calls and tried to match handwriting samples, vehicle descriptions, and witness sketches. They compared ballistics and catalogued ammunition. The .44 caliber revolver, an oddly intimate detail, surfaced in certain reports, and the image of that weapon threaded through files and testimony. The detectives were careful, even as the pressure mounted. The mayor's office wanted answers, neighborhood groups wanted protection, and the newspapers wanted stories that would calm or clarify. Everyone wanted the same result, but through different channels. Those months were tiring in a new way. The public's anxiety was practical. Couples altered habits, women cut their hair, people avoided cars at night, and dates migrated indoors. There was a heavier air to the city, and the newsroom felt like its monitor. At the Ledger, we worked late each night to collect the latest precinct reports and to digest them into copy that would inform without inflaming. One of the striking things, at least to me, was the sense that the killer could be anyone. It was an ordinary person scenario. Someone who could blend in with neighbors, someone who might drive a city car or walk a dog at midnight. The uncertainty was part of what made the entire city unsettled. Was he the quiet man who kept to himself in a third-floor walk-up? Was he the young man who walked his dog at midnight and tipped his hat to the passerby? The possibility that a neighbor or someone you saw every day could be responsible altered the texture of how people looked at one another. Thousands of tips arrived at the precinct and at the paper. I remember one packet that came to the Ledger, a string of handwritten notes from a caller who described a man with a limp they had seen near a park at midnight. Another man called and insisted he had seen an older car parked on a certain block the night of one of the shootings. The detectives took all of it seriously, and they had to. I watched them comb through what may have seemed like small details and match them against other, larger ones. Community meetings began to form, church basements filled with worried neighbors. The city council demanded updates. People wanted to know if there were patterns in time or geography. Detectives and community leaders tried to be candid while also preserving investigative secrecy. They asked the public for patience, which in the summer of a city on edge felt like a small mercy. At the Ledger, I learned to listen for the thin differences in people's language about fear. Some spoke of practical changes, brighter headlights, different bus routes, while others confessed to a deeper kind of unease. I remember a woman telling me she had started leaving the television on at night because the silence made her feel like a target. Another man told me he had taken to walking his daughter to the subway each morning rather than letting her stand alone at a corner. These were small acts of care. They were how people in the city adapted without surrendering to panic. Surveillance tactics were practical and sometimes humble. Plainclothes units staked out in cars that looked like any other, parking under a streetlight to watch. Police used call logs to triangulate where tips came from and looked for patterns. License plate sightings, vehicle descriptions, witness observations. The pressure from city officials meant that the task force often had to balance thoroughness with speed. It is always difficult to move quickly without missing something. The detectives learned to cross-check every lead they could. Do you feel your eyelids getting heavier? Let that happen now. We've looked at how the city responded and how ordinary life changed around the edges. In the next chapter, we will talk about the letters that began to arrive, pages and envelopes that shifted the case into the public sphere in a different way, and how the police and the press both reacted to being taunted. But that is a story for the next chapter. Take a soft breath. Let the air move in and out, slow and even. We have traced the neighborhoods and watched the city adapt. Now let us gather some of the pieces that began to clack together on detectives' desks and on the Ledger's copy table. Tonight, I will speak of the fragments. Witness sketches, ballistics reports, small notes taken in precinct corners, and the letters that began to arrive. When an investigation stretches over months, the evidence takes on a particular smell of paper and dust. It is a room full of folded photographs, taped envelopes, and the rusty clipboards that have been in use too long. At the precinct, where I spent late hours, stacks of reports formed low towers on battered tables. Each report had a name at the top, and a sentence beneath that meant everything to the loved ones. Assault, wounded, killed. The detectives catalogued ammunition details and photographed cars. At the Ledger, we filed and refiled copies of these documents and tried to translate them into language that the public could follow without panicking. Witnesses were often shaky and sometimes inconsistent. It is natural. People remember different angles in a moment of classically sudden violence. A detail observed by one person might be missed by another. Sketch artists worked in dim light to render faces that could, at times, be only glimpsed. Sometimes the sketches produced a helpful likeness. Sometimes they produced contradictions. Detectives cross-checked descriptions of height, clothing, and mannerisms. A man's gait, a way he held his head. These small traits mattered. Ballistics, too, told a parallel story. .44 caliber rounds were noted in several cases. Detectives collected shell casings and tried to match them to a firearm if one could be found. Ballistics testing is both technical and slow. It takes patience. It also gives a kind of stubborn clarity in a case where human memory can be frayed. And then there were the letters. They came in stages. Small notes first, then longer handwritten letters sent to police and to reporters, which was when the press and the police knew that the voice in print might be part of the case. The letters used a taunting language that was unmistakable. They were, in the public sense of the word, performative. They wanted an audience. One of the phrases that began to recur and which entered public conversation was the name the letters supplied, Son of Sam. It was a name that clicked in the papers and in people's mouths, a label that made the threat into a persona. I will tell you, gently, that I encountered one of those letters in person. As a reporter, I was sometimes handed copies by detectives who wanted to gauge how the press would handle them. I remember unfolding a thin envelope under a buzzing newsroom light. The paper inside had been folded carefully. The language was stylized and assertive, and the signature, Son of Sam, was scrawled in a way that made the words look like a shriek flattened by ink. Reading the letter felt strange. There was, in it, a voice that wanted to be seen and read. It referenced things only the killer might know, or at least it put that claim forward. The letter's tone was taunting but also oddly self-conscious, as if the writer was trying to craft an identity as much as declare responsibility. The press, of course, printed excerpts. The city read those lines over breakfast. I remember the way our typesetters hesitated, then set the type, then ran off copies to the bins, the rumble of the press a steady, reassuring counterpoint to words designed to incite fear. The existence of letters complicated the case. Now the investigators faced not only the physical evidence of cartridges and locations, but the psychic evidence of a voice that wanted attention. Some detectives and editors debated whether to publish lines from the letters at all. Publishing could feed the voice that sought an audience. Withholding could leave the public in the dark. The decision was never simple. At the Ledger, we chose to be careful, reporting the fact of the letters, paraphrasing certain lines for clarity, and trying not to amplify the rhythm of fear. The media frenzy that followed was a double-edged thing. Coverage informed citizens and sometimes produced helpful tips, but it also amplified the killer's reach and helped shape the myth of Son of Sam. Callers phoned in with names of suspects, with offhand observations. The precinct's tip line grew almost to a humming organism of its own. Detectives had to sort signal from noise. I remember nights when the tip line at the paper and the line at the precinct rang simultaneously for hours. In the task force room, I had seen piles of letters compared side by side. Handwriting, paper fibers, postmarks. Each piece was examined with dispassionate care. Detectives sometimes invited me to compare a letter with other items in the file. Those were confidential moments I would carry quietly. My job as a reporter was, in part, to bear witness and to report. But there is also a private duty I felt to those I wrote about, to keep the horror from consuming them in print and to let their names remain human. People began to change behavior even more. Couples stopped parking in the same places. Teens admitted to their parents that they wanted to sleep in friends' living rooms rather than walk home. Women's conversations included practical questions about routes and timing. It did not stop the city, but it shifted its modest habits. As you hear my voice now, think about the slow work of this phase, how letters, witness sketches, and ballistics data form a kind of mosaic. The detectives were patient glue workers. They tried to assemble the picture, piece by piece. Do you feel your breathing steady? Let it become a quiet companion. In the next chapter, I will tell you about an unexpected person who would later be identified, and about some of the reasons why a case like this can grow complicated with claims about demons, cults, and neighborhood dogs. But that is a story for the next chapter. Breathe slowly. Let your hands rest heavy by your sides. In this chapter, I will tell you about the unexpected turns the investigation took, about the person who would later be identified, and about the strange claims that followed. Voices, demons, and a neighbor's dog. I will be careful and quiet in my telling. Remember that I did not know everything at once. I am remembering the way knowledge arrived. Slow, piecemeal, and sometimes circuitous. There is a name you already know. David Richard Berkowitz. He is a man whose life was threaded into the case's later chapters. But in the beginning, he was not the obvious figure in anyone's mind. He was, to most people who encountered him in ordinary settings, unremarkable. A young man who blended into city blocks and into the background noise of everyday life. That ordinary appearance is one of the things that shocked people after his arrest. Berkowitz had been adopted as an infant. That detail later became part of many narratives about him. Adoption is a quiet fact, full of potential tender or wrenching stories, but it is not, on its own, an explanation for violence. As the press later learned more about his background, they wrote of his isolation and of difficulties in school and work. These details are clinical and somber when set down in a podcast meant to soothe. The human things remain. A small handful of odd jobs, long walks at night, a man who sometimes kept to himself. Months into the investigation, a narrative emerged that no one could have entirely predicted. Berkowitz's claim that he heard voices. He told investigators later, after arrest, that the voices had commanded him to kill, and that they were supernatural in nature. He described, in interviews and in his statements, the sense of hearing a voice that compelled action. Such claims complicated the case because they invoked questions about mental health, criminal responsibility, and the way we assign agency to acts of violence. There was also the neighbor's dog narrative. Berkowitz said the voices came from, or were connected to, a dog owned by a neighbor named Sam. That detail, Sam's dog, was one of the elements that captured the public imagination. It was strange and particular. A man claiming demonic compulsion through a dog. Newsrooms, always hungry for a simple image that would help the public apprehend complexity, ran with the line, and people began to ask questions in coffee shops and on stoops. Was it literal? Was it symbolic? Was it a way of expressing a deeper turmoil? I remember these conversations in the Ledger's newsroom. The hushed theorizing, the editor's raised eyebrows, the reporters leaning close. As a reporter, I held my skepticism quietly. Claims of voices and demons are part of the human repertoire for describing terrible internal experiences. They can be metaphors and they can be real experiences of hallucination. The job of a journalist in such a moment is to record the claim faithfully and to note how authorities respond. Detectives and psychiatrists later examined Berkowitz's mental state. Evaluations were performed, and then, and this is important, he eventually confessed to the shootings. The confession, coupled with the forensic evidence the task force had been assembling, created a mosaic that led to charging him. Who was David Berkowitz then, in those months? He was in his early 20s, born in 1953, which put him at about 24 at the time of his arrest in 1907. He lived in Yonkers for a time and had been, to neighbors, an ordinary sort of young man. The ordinary can hide a great distance between how people seem and how they feel. There were also strange public digressions. After his confession, Berkowitz later claimed that he had been involved in a larger conspiracy, that a cult or group had been involved. Those claims would swirl in years to come. Some investigators and many outside observers found those later claims unconvincing. Others thought them possible. In my notebook, I recorded the confusion, the doubts, and the steady returns to the evidence on the table. The police were not satisfied with narratives that left too many gaps. Detectives cross-checked Berkowitz's statements against the physical evidence, the letter analyses, the witness descriptions, the ballistics matches. The detectives continued to press. There is a quiet, stubborn logic to police work. It does not accept metaphors when concrete data are available. But it is also true that the human mind can hold multiple truths. A man can be troubled and violent, troubled and literate in letters, troubled and able to convince himself of a supernatural influence. I remember the city in those months as a place of whispers and half-believed stories. Some people wanted a neat explanation. Mental illness, a loner acting alone, a cult. Each explanation felt to someone like a piece of ease. To others, it seemed unsatisfactory. The detectives continued to do their work, cross-referencing witness statements, analyzing handwriting, matching ballistics, and I continued to write about it. My role was to be careful with how I presented claims that might cause more fear than useful understanding. There is a certain humility that came to my writing in those months. I began to feel more protective of names. I learned to be gentle in describing people who had suffered. I watched my city move in smaller ways toward caution and compassion. Neighbors checking on neighbors, more streetlights left on, a little extra vigilance on the trains. We adapted without succumbing. Do you feel calm yet? Breathe in and out slowly. In the next chapter, we'll speak of the day an arrest was made, how a parking ticket and witness descriptions turned into an ending of a sort, and how I, a reporter, learned that the man who had been named in the press had, in fact, been taken into custody on August the 10th, 1907. But that is a story for the next chapter. Take a quiet breath. Let the rhythm of your breath match the soft cadence of these next words. In this chapter, I will tell you about the day the city learned someone had been taken into custody, how a seemingly small detail, a parking ticket, helped lead detectives to a name, and about the mixture of relief and doubt that followed. It was late in the summer of 1907 when the arrest happened. The date that lives on in the files is August 10th, 1907. I remember it because the newsroom felt different that morning. There was a tautness, an electric patience, like the moment just before a long-held breath exits. The task force had been following leads for months. Detectives had been checking parking records and canvassing neighborhoods. They were looking at letters, at sketches, at shell casings, and at hundreds of tips stacked in thick manila files. One seemingly small item, a parking ticket, became part of the web that converged on a suspect. The ticket had been issued near the scene of a later incident, and detectives traced it back. Through vehicle registrations and small clerical details, to a car that brought them closer to a name. Witness descriptions, imperfect, human, often fragmentary, also lined up. When combined with the physical evidence and the sudden appearance of a suspect's name in multiple threads, detectives felt they had grounds to act. When they did act, they arrested a man by the name of David Richard Berkowitz. He was taken into custody on August 10, 1977. The precinct called the Ledger and other papers, and word travelled quickly. I remember the call from the sergeant, matter of fact, careful, and the smell of newsprint as the newsroom prepared to roll type. You could feel a relief in the room, raw and immediate, but also the careful watchfulness of people who know that arrest is a step in a long process, not its end. When I first heard Berkowitz's name, I felt a momentary private hope. Often in a long case, an arrest means the terminus of anxiety for many citizens. People imagine the end of a worry, but I also knew as a reporter that arrests come with many questions. We are trained to report the facts and to remain cautious. I kept my pen steady. Soon after his arrest, the details that followed were both human and bureaucratic. The detectives read him his rights. He was questioned. In the long hours that followed, Berkowitz confessed. He admitted to firing the shots in multiple incidents. He also gave statements about how he heard voices that told him to act. And he referenced the neighbor's dog narrative that we had begun to hear in whispers. His confession was a pivotal thing. It provided a direct account that aligned in key ways with the physical evidence. In the precinct's interview rooms, Berkowitz spoke about feelings of compulsion and about a voice. The detectives and, later, psychiatrists evaluated his claims and his mental state. They filed reports and assessments. I read some of those reports later, as the paper worked its way through coverage, and I tried to hold skepticism and empathy side by side. Skepticism toward a claim that could be used to excuse violence, and empathy for a person who might genuinely suffer from mental disturbance. The public's reaction was complex. There was relief, certainly, that someone had been captured. That relief sat alongside a strange curiosity about the particulars of his life. Reporters tried as carefully as we could to trace his biography: adoption, awkward youth, failed jobs, and a life that had, in many quiet ways, been ordinary. He did not, to outward appearances, fit the image of a monster. He was a neighbor who kept to himself, a man who could sit in a diner and pass unnoticed. That ordinariness made the whole thing feel more unsettling to many people. Berkowitz's confession and the subsequent reports of his claims, the voices, the demonic influence he alleged, and the later claim that he had been part of a larger conspiracy, complicated public understanding. Many questioned whether such claims were true or whether they were attempts to shape public perception. The detectives and prosecutors had to decide what parts of those claims were relevant to the case and what could be tested by evidence. As a reporter, my role was to record the facts as fully and plainly as I could. The Ledger published accounts of the arrest, the confession, and the medical evaluations that followed. We included, in our pieces, cautious language about the claims of demonic voices, language that made clear these were the suspect's statements, not settled fact. Many readers appreciated the care. Some readers wanted blunt certainty, which reporters seldom have. There were also quieter moments. I remember standing outside the courthouse on a humid afternoon and watching the slow rotation of people arriving to see the proceedings. Families of victims moved through the crowd with quiet dignity. Friends and neighbors stood in small clumps, speaking in low voices. In the background, the city continued. Buses moving through avenues, streetlights humming into night. And still, even after an arrest, the city's questions did not all disappear. Was there only one person involved? Were there accomplices? Could other people have been responsible for similar attacks elsewhere? These were questions that remained in the air because investigations rarely shut like a trapdoor. They closed slowly, with continuations in other forms. Court documents, filings, and sometimes unresolved whisperings. Do you feel the quiet settling? Let your shoulders relax. In the next chapter, I will tell you about the confession itself, the court appearances, and what came to be known as Berkowitz's sentencing. I will also speak about the city's long and slow path, back towards something like normal. But that is a story for the next chapter. Take a deep breath. Let the inhalation be soft, and let the exhalation be long. We have followed the city through fear and investigation. In this chapter, I will speak of the admission of guilt, the court files, the sentence, and the ways that New York slowly started to put pieces back into place. After David Richard Berkowitz's arrest on August 10, 1977, the legal process began a steady motion that is both public and procedural. He confessed to the shootings and made statements about hearing voices that commanded him. In court and in interviews, those claims about voices and demonic force entered both the legal record and the public imagination. Many people tried to fit what he said into frameworks they knew: mental illness, religious mania, or a deliberate attempt to create an explanation that would reduce culpability. The courts moved at their careful pace. Berkowitz ultimately pleaded guilty to the shootings. He did not go through a prolonged jury trial on those counts. Instead, a guilty plea was entered, and he was sentenced. The sentence was 6 consecutive terms of 25 years to life. That is a weighty and specific formal outcome, a sentence that ensured he would remain in custody for the rest of his life, unless extraordinary legal conditions changed that arrangement. I was there the day the papers ran the details of the plea and the sentence. It felt, in one sense, like a closure of a chapter. Families of victims had a formal answer in the justice system. Yet a quiet skepticism remained in public conversation. Some people felt vindicated that someone had been held responsible. Others wrestled with doubts. Could one man truly have been responsible for everything that had happened? Were there parts of the story that remained unwritten? Over the next years, Berkowitz's story took additional turns that would interest scholars and casual readers alike. He later made claims suggesting possible cult involvement, a narrative that suggested that culpability might extend to others. These claims were reviewed by authorities and debated in the public sphere. Many investigators and analysts found insufficient evidence to support such broad conspiracy theories. The official record stayed focused on Berkowitz's admissions and the evidence the task force had assembled. There were, nonetheless, inconsistencies and items that did not fit neatly. Witness recollections sometimes diverged. Timelines could be read in multiple ways. Some researchers have, over the decades, returned to the case to ask whether every question had a tidy answer. Those doubts are not always proof of a deeper crime. Often, they are reminders that memory, evidence, and human error are part of any long investigation. What changed on the streets after the sentencing? Not everything changed at once, of course. The city's ordinary life did not snap back to a pre-fear rhythm with the expediency of a switch flip. People who had altered habits for safety, those who avoided parked cars late at night, those who walked home in groups, continued those practices for a time. But slowly, like a tide, the edges of fear receded. Couples stopped being as vigilant about where they parked. Late-night diners once again filled with laughter and small talk. The city learned to incorporate the memory of those months into the fabric of regular life. For me, professionally and personally, there was a slow recalibration. I kept covering community news and other city stories. But the Son of Sam case remained a long note in my memory. I met, in the intervening years, friends who told me they had stopped parking in certain lots, or who had cut their hair as a practical measure. I met families who, with great dignity, carried on living in neighborhoods that had once been riven by fear. there is a very human aftermath that the legal files don't always capture. Survivors rebuild, sometimes in small and private ways. Some people change jobs or move to different neighborhoods. Others plant flowers on windowsills and continue to tip their hats to neighbors who walk dogs at midnight. The city, resilient and enormous, learns to hold its pain and its normalcy together. As for Berkowitz, he was brought into the prison system and received his sentence. The legal status and the long confessions and later claims have been studied and debated. For the families of those lost that summer, the sentencing was a complicated point, a formal recognition of responsibility, yes, but also a marker in a longer story of grief and recovery. Do you feel your heartbeat slow to match the room? Let that steadiness be your companion now. In the next chapter, I will reflect a little more on lingering doubts, on the questions that followed, and on how the city, over years, remembered those months. We will talk about how a place as busy as New York keeps its scars quietly, and how sometimes unanswered questions remain, not as threats, but as gentle, difficult memories. But that is a story for the next chapter. Take a slow breath. Feel the currency of the air as it travels in and out. In this chapter, I will speak in a quieter register about what lingered, the questions that did not fully settle, the small rituals people adopted in the city afterward, and what I, years later, still carry with me when I think of those nights. When a case like this unfolds, it does not become a single object with a clear edge. It becomes a cloud of memories, filings, and conversations. Some parts are wrapped in official records, arrest reports, court documents, and sentencing transcripts, while other parts live in neighborhoods as small habits and as stories told at kitchen tables. People who lived through those months remember what they changed. A different route home, a phone call to check in, a small light left on in the hallway. There have always been lingering doubts and unanswered questions about aspects of the case. Even after an arrest and a legal resolution, people discuss timeline inconsistencies in witness accounts and debate whether there could have been accomplices. Some evidence seemed to align perfectly. Other evidence had corners and soft edges. Over the years, these questions have fed books, documentaries, and conversations in local bars and academic forums. They do not necessarily mean that the official account is false. They mean that human memory and human systems are complicated. I must tell you, in that quiet way that reporters sometimes keep, that I have a deep respect for the detectives who worked that long summer and autumn. The task force sifted through thousands of tips and held the city's worry in their hands. Police work is slow and detailed, and even when it produces an arrest, it leaves many small threads that do not instantly knit together. I remember detectives staying late, comparing handwriting, rechecking ballistics, and going back to canvas neighborhoods they had visited months before. There is a kind of doggedness in that work that is underappreciated. On the other hand, I also carry with me the skepticism I mentioned earlier. Claims of cult involvement or of supernatural compulsion demand careful scrutiny. They can be narratives pushed and pulled by emotion, by sensational media, and by people's desire for a tidy explanation. We must always try to separate what is provable from what is plausible, from what is simply part of a person's own self-protected storytelling. There were personal conversations I will never forget. Years later, a woman who had shortened her hair in that anxious summer told me she had done it because she felt it was a way to control something in a world that felt temporarily hollowed out. She said it helped her feel practical and safe, And that small act stayed with her as a symbol of how resilience can be ordinary. Another friend told me that she still slightly preferred to walk with a companion at night. Those daily choices are a kind of human archive, small testimonies to how people manage fear. How did New York remember those months? Not with a single unified monument, but in many quiet ways. A line in a neighborhood paper, a plaque in a community garden, a family's private ritual. The city continued. The lamplight on my street kept humming. New diners opened, children were born, trains slowed and sped. Life, which is arguably the sanest and strongest thing about cities, quietly reasserted itself. And yet memories persist. For some, the Son of Sam period remained a reference point whenever the news reported another spree somewhere else. People would say, "Remember that summer?" and exchange a knowing look. Memory becomes shorthand for caution and for the ways a city heals. I have been asked many times whether I think every question in that case was answered. The honest reply is, not every question. Some were resolved satisfactorily through confession and through physical evidence. Others remained shaded and open. Conspiracy theories can sprout in the spaces left by uncertainty, and while some are worth examining, many more are born of anxiety and the need for tidy narratives. There was a more personal question I would ask myself as a reporter. What did this do to me? The case made me more attentive, yes, but it also taught me a kind of careful empathy. I learned to handle names as if they were small, fragile things. I watched how a city's ordinary life can be altered by fear and how it can reclaim its routines, slowly and with grace. Do you feel the room relaxing? Let that be your companion as we move toward the end of this telling. I want you to know that what you have heard is a memory, held carefully. I have kept the names as constant threads. Donna Lauria, Jody Valenti, Carl Denaro, Virginia Voskerichian, Christine Freund, Stacy Moskowitz, and David Richard Berkowitz. I have used them the same way in my notebook and in my voice today. Those lives are not simply pieces of newsprint, they are human. In the final chapter, we will bring this evening to a soft close. I will speak of silence after fear, the city's continuing hum, and how a kind of unresolved calm can become its own quiet ending. But that is a story for the next chapter. Take a very soft breath now. Let your limbs feel heavy and kind. We have walked together through nights of a city that was both ordinary and then unsettled, through investigation rooms, through letters written in an ink that wanted attention, and through an arrest that gave some answer, but not everyone. Now we will close gently. There is an ending that is not dramatic. That is the kind of ending I prefer to remember. After David Richard Berkowitz's conviction and sentencing, 6 consecutive terms of 25 years to life, the city did not erupt in a single moment of catharsis. Instead, the ordinary life of New York continued to stitch itself back together. People resumed small routines that had been interrupted. Couples who had avoided parking on certain streets began to choose them again, with a cautious optimism. Late-night diners filled gradually, and the hush of the city at 2 a.m. took on its usual, less suspicious sound. For those who lost someone, the judicial resolution did not erase grief. Family and friends endured their evenings and anniversaries and quiet hours with a private kind of mourning. Some of them found comfort in small rituals, lighting a candle, gathering at a grave once a year, or placing a small bouquet by a stoop. Some of them continued to check in on friends. These are not tidy endings. They are slow, dignified continuations. The case left behind questions that some people still discuss. The late-night patterns and the imperfect timelines. The claims of voices and the later allegations of cult involvement. Those debates are part of the public record now. They have inspired books and documentaries and many late-night conversations. But for the quiet life of a city, they become a part of the background. History that is acknowledged and then tucked into a broader story of how people live and care for one another. In the years since, I have walked my neighborhood as the city changed slowly. New flowering trees were planted where old ones had been cut. Shop windows reflected different slogans. The stoop I once passed every night now hosts a young couple who sip coffee quietly, laughing softly in the morning sun. The streetlight outside my old window still hums, though perhaps a little more gently now. As I think back, I remember small quotidian things more than the howl of headlines. I remember the way a neighbor would offer me a newspaper when we were both leaving for the day. I remember the smell of a bakery on a corner where the case had not reached. I remember putting my notebook in the pocket of my coat and walking home with its pages filled with names I had sworn to keep consistent. These are the memories that keep me steady. It is natural, when thinking of such times, to feel a residual edge. There are people who keep an alert in their chest, especially those who are directly affected. For many others, the days that once seemed dangerous became simply days again. New York has always been a place where people absorb change and go on living. That persistence is not callousness. It is continuity. It is proof that people find a way to carry terror in one hand and tenderness in the other. Before I leave you for the night, a few quiet thoughts. If you are listening from a dim room with a lamp on a bedside table, know that the city hum out the outside your window is likely breathing in and out too. Someone may be sitting at a late table, stirring tea. Someone may be reading a small paperback. There is consolation in the ordinary, I have learned, in the way neighbors check on neighbors, and in the way a diner worker knows your coffee order. If this story made you think of places where safety matters, consider sending a note or a comment to say where you are listening from and what time it is. The simple act of sharing the small geography of our lives reminds us that cities are not only places on a map, but shared spaces of breath and memory. Take one last long breath now and let it out slowly. Picture the streetlight outside my old window, yellow and steady. Hear the faint, distant rumble of a bus, a dog's soft bark, the distant hum of a radio. The city continues. It carries its grief and its resilience together, and it lets the quiet nights fold themselves around people who, like you and I, want to rest. Good night. Sleep well. Let the hum of the city outside carry you to gentle dreams. Thank you for listening to this true story, told softly, and for keeping your sleep calm. If you feel like it, come back again for another small, careful telling. Sweet dreams.